think, Mustafa, we can see you clearly and we could hear you, but now you are unmute and we cannot hear you, but I can see that you're speaking. So just to check one more time before we start with before we go on to the live stream, we are live streaming, but that's fine. We can do a few minutes to just check. There you go. Now you're loud and clear.
I know what the problem is. Okay, so speaker, no. Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Loud and clear. Perfect.
Great. Excellent.
Okay. All right. Maybe we kick us off since we have a full house. I think I haven't just heard, I think Marvin, Marvin joining us from the Netherlands. I think you're with us, but I just haven't seen your video on and to do a sound check, but I'm sure it should be fine. A warm welcome to everyone and thank you for being with us here today. Every Tuesday, as it was since September, we've been holding conversations or webinars where we invite various experts to join us on these panel discussions that are really exploring and diving a bit deeper into the Global Compact for Migration objectives, 23 of them. So we had a big task at hand when we started this off in September, and we are already at number 17. So indeed, time does fly, and it's been some very interesting and impactful discussions that try to also push us off what we're used to. So at the same time, we do realize that this webinar is taking place within the context of a Global Compact for Migration certification course that we are running jointly with four organizations, the MFA, the CCRM, the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, and the Civil Society Action Committee have been running this program since September. So we do have students, scholars, experts with us in the room that join us every Tuesday for different conversations, always centered around one of the Global Compact for Migration objectives. And I invite you to catch up over the 16 on the YouTube channel of GRFTT, and that's easy to find. So without much further ado, today's discussion is looking at elimination of all forms of discrimination and promoting evidence-based public discourse towards shaping the perception of migration. Now, our topic is hot. Our topic is uncomfortably hot to handle. It's contentious, it's loaded with variants, depending really where you're viewing it from on the planet Earth. It's like a virus that's been with us for centuries. And it's a sticky one because we can't mask up for it, we can't sanitize away, and even a PM 2.5 mask, or even I guess the 100% based alcohol sanitizer won't help us here. Globally and at various levels of governments, of states, regional communities, groups of people, scholars, civil society, and even scientists have been searching for a vaccine to protect and possibly eradicate the undesirable acts of humankind discriminating against humankind on whatever basis unimaginable. Now, before people start signing off, thinking that, or calling friends over to say there's a conversation around a COVID vaccine discussion here, just to make it clear, we are talking about discrimination, and we are privileged to have a very full-packed panel. We have 6 panelists on our panel that will help us dive into this topic, that really tries to see what has been happening around the spaces and all of government, all of society, trying to work together to eliminate all forms of discrimination and promoting evidence-based public discourse to shape the perception of migration. So it is a virally loaded topic. And I hope that that you can buckle your seats and you can just take your glass of water and have a cup of coffee, because I don't think you want to miss any of what will be happening. We have a Q&A, we have a chat box. I'm always careful to say that it's a chat box there that you can throw your questions into as we go along. Each of the panelists will be able to answer the questions as we go along. It's very interactive in style, so we'll be going back and forth around the different topics. It's a very loaded objective as well, and therefore I just quickly introduce my panel. So we have 6 panelists who will speak in this order. They're coming from civil society organizations, including migrant advocacy groups, media, education, as well as international organizations. So we have Vasco Malta, who is the head of mission, joining us from the international organization for Migration from Portugal. We have Elena Dana, who is the Communications Officer of NoCap Association. Hi, Elena. She's joining us from Italy, and she will tell us a bit more. We have Eva Garzon, who is the Migration and Displacement Lead from Oxfam Intermon. Mustafa Kadri, who is the founder and executive director from Equidem, based in the UK. Marvin Hoxton, who is a journalist and educator with Afro Magazine, and will tell us a bit more about his work beyond Afro Magazine as an educator as well. And then last but not the least, we have Andrew Kaur, who is a member of the Bar Council, Migrants, Refugees and Immigration Affairs Committee based in Malaysia. So it's a packed panel with a lot of loaded questions, as I said, and I think we are sitting at a very good time. Yesterday, the United States was celebrating Martin Luther King's Day, so it's a day in which they commemorate this influential African-American civil rights leader who was really from, his life and his achievements are being remembered for the efforts and the campaigns that he made to end racial segregation, not just on public transport, but also looking at racial equality in the United States. But I think that inspiration flows even as we are sitting in this group. So without much further ado, let me start by introducing to you our first speaker, Mr. Vasco Malta, who is the head of mission for IOM Portugal. And Vasco joins us with many different hats before he joined IOM Portugal as its chief of office. And previously he has worked as a legal advisor to the Commission for Equality and Against Racial Discrimination, and was part of the Portuguese National Commission for Human Rights. He was also appointed by the Portuguese government before that to work as a national liaison officer for the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. He has worked as a deputy of a High Commissioner for Migration in Portugal, as well as looking at issues related to migration policy, international relations, enrollment of migrants for the High Commissioner for Migrants, High Commissioner for Migration. And he has previously, just before he joined IOM, he was appointed as the deputy of the Portuguese Minister for Home Affairs, where he worked in different areas, looking at migration, refugees, trafficking of human beings. And now he is with the IOM as its head of mission in Portugal. He's been called as a guest speaker, and actually that is how I have known Vasco, who has become a friend and somebody that really inspires me, because he really leads from that passion side of things. Now, Vasco, I just wondered if you could just, knowing these various experiences that you have had and really being vested into the subject, that, looking for, equality against, looking just at equality and against racial discrimination in your capacity. Do you just want to sort of take us through? We're in a period of COVID-19, and UN Secretary General, as well as many other speakers, as well as IOM Director General, have really looked at this as saying that we are in a tsunami, and the tsunami is not just the tsunami of COVID, but it's a tsunami of racial discrimination, intolerance, and xenophobia. What can we see as the link between COVID-19 and the growth of discriminatory behavior against migrants?
Dear Patty, dear guests, and dear panelists, first of all, let me thank you first of all to the invitation. It's a really an honor to be here today and to share a little bit about my experience, and that is not that big because, as you can see, I'm a very young person. Nevertheless, I would I would highlight one or two, three things that would be connected to the topic. So first of all, yes, you are absolutely correct. So you mentioned the UN Secretary General. So on 8th of May of 2020, he was actually one of the first ones to come publicly and said that he is being reported a tsunami of hate and xenophobia. So indeed, hate and discrimination against migrants in many countries is currently still exacerbated due to the misinformation and fears associated to the COVID-19 pandemic. So Since the beginning of the pandemic, numerous of xenophobic incidents, hate speeches, and crimes against persons on basis of their real or perceived national origin have been reported. And I bring here some of the cases actually that have been reported to IOM and United Nations. So first of all, I think we all agree that there was, at least for some of the states, that there was or some of politicians adopted alternative names for the COVID-19 coronavirus. So instead of using the international recognized name of the virus, some officials have adopted names with geographic references, typically referring it to its emergency in China. So we also have received, besides what we can all witness that have been reported, some real cases of real persons. And I decided to bring up actually some real cases. So we have been reported about refusal to sit down next to passengers with certain or perceived ethnic origin on public transports, on the metros and buses. There are being reported a lot of verbal attacks and insults on the streets and also in social media. We have, of course, been reported by, bullying at work and schools against migrants. We have been reported by discriminatory evictions. We have been reported about termination of employment on basis of perceived national origin. And we have a lot of reported about verbal political attacks against free movement regimes, such as within the EU. And of course, we have been reported back about closing of business according to the national origin, or permitting shops and business to open according to the nationality of its owners. So we have different levels of discriminatory incidents that have been reported, and they all somehow are interlinked in three, let's say, crises. So a health crisis, a socioeconomic crisis, and the protection crisis. And besides that, of course, xenophobia and hate speeches have also proliferate in media. So online petitions, in social media posts have been maliciously circulated, attracting some comments and violent threats towards migrants. So this is actually the status quo that IOM have
Hey,
been.
Bajit, আমার এই 5 টাকা নোট আছে।
Sorry about that.
No problem, no problem. So I was just saying this is exactly the status quo that we have received so far, and that we have received the report from different manners. So this is exactly that I want to refer to as the status quo that we are facing right now. And then I guess I will be focusing on what would be the key solutions on solving this situation. And I stop from here.
Thank you, Vasco. I was just also wondering, of course, we know that some of these cases could have been reported even pre-COVID, and probably what has happened during COVID is that cases have just been heightened. Reports and complaints have just sort of doubled, tripled in some of the cases, especially discrimination against migrants. Do you want to walk us through and talk to us about what IOM has done? I think, let's say, even from the point of view of the work that you're doing there in IOM, in working with governments to ensure that when we enter periods of pandemic, or when we enter periods of distress of any sort, we're able to find mechanisms that help to redress.
Thank you so much, Patty. Yeah, well, so the solutions for this xenophobic attacks and hate speeches in the context of the pandemic should develop along, I would say, two lines of intervention. So first of all, as a lawyer, as I am, I think it's very important the adoption of a solid legal and policy framework aiming to prevent xenophobia and hate crimes against migrants, and of course sanctioning this responsible while promoting peaceful and living peaceful living in our society. So first of all, the legal aspect, the adoption of a solid legal aspect, and second of all, a community-based approaches to reduce prejudice and facilitate social cohesion. So this is actually very, very important. And so these are the two key solutions. But if you want me to, to be more concretely, I would say that it would be very important following the recommendations that actually the IOM promoted to combat xenophobia and hate speech in the context of pandemic. So in more concrete way, what the IOM proposed as the solutions are around 5 specific recommendations. Sorry, I have 1 second.
It's okay. That was a good break. Okay.
I'm
That's
really sorry.
fine.
I was just someone was just next to me here, my small dog. I'm sorry for this.
That's
Anyway,
fine.
so I was telling you that IOM proposed 5 specific recommendations. So besides the enhanced legislative and policy frameworks against hate crimes, so it is important to proactively address xenophobia and hate speech in online fora. It is important because we have seen, and the numbers do not lie, that there is a growth, a substantial growth due to COVID as well against migrants in the online. So it is important, and we can work actually with social media on this as well. I think there is a role to be played by the major social media as Facebook, as Twitter, and we have seen this, and they have opened a precedent, a very important precedent right now when what happened in the USA and banning some of the accounts. So it is something that we should work with, and also to promote, as I said, evidence-based and stigma-free language in all communication channels. All right, so it is important to understand that the language matters, and so it is really important to provide this stigma-free language in all communication channels. Also to strengthen the whole of community approaches to reducing prejudice and promoting social cohesion, and of course to develop and strengthen prejudice reduction and anti-discrimination measures with recovery plans. So all of this, I mean, this is exactly the key recommendations that IOM announced on this paper that was promoted on July 2020, and it's online, so you can briefly look it up and look it up. So this is exactly the key recommendations, and in the end, I mean, I'm sure there are other key other speakers that want to speak about it. I can explain you a little bit more about what we have done concretely ourselves when shaping the image of migrants through the communication, how we did it, how our campaigns did it, how did we raise awareness campaigns that we have done in the past. So I can share with you in the future about a little bit about that as well.
Thank you, Vasco. And actually what we'll be doing is just, dropping all these links from the different speakers, from the various organizations, research work that's been done, policy frameworks that have been adopted, recommendations that make it also a bit easier for others to follow. I'm really sorry. From time to time, we get people who are a little bit too happy in the day, or maybe have had too much coffee and are happy to join us with some music. Apologies for that interruption, but I think that we are actually, set. If I can just quickly move on to our next speaker, I think Vasco really ended it very well there, talking about shaping of campaigns. And I think this is an organization, and Elena, I'm coming to you, an organization that has started really from what seemed as a one-man campaign, if I can put it this way, and I think you will put it better, and elevated it into what is standing as a 10-year advocacy advocacy group that works with migrant workers in Italy. But before I do that, let me just introduce Elena Dana. And Elena Dana works on communication and management within NOCAP Association, which is based a migrants advocacy group that's based in Italy. She will tell us a bit more about it. Elena has a background in criminal and immigration law, and she studied at the University of Bologna. She has also done some research work looking at international cooperation and sustainable development in Brazil and Albania. And she has been working with NOCAP for over the last 3 years, covering different projects. And without much further ado, maybe I'll ask you, Elena, I think in our conversations, we had a very nice long conversation the other day where we were, really touching on not just, where NOCAP has come from as sort of a one-man. What I saw, the first interaction that I had with NOCAP, and I will share that link over, is from your founder, who really started, off as being on a farm, working as a migrant, and seeing the kind of grievances that migrant workers had, and really taking it from advocacy to action. So we would like to hear a little bit more about that, and knowing that, you have moved from this, line of work where it was more about fair, ethical recruitment and work conditions for migrant workers, and how you're looking at decent work essentially for all workers. So Elena, do you want to take us through that?
I'll do my best. I'm very honored to be in such a great, let's say online. It's not a real meeting, but it's like not concrete, but online. I'm really glad to be part of this, and I will start to tell you some more about NOCAP. NOCAP is an association that fights gang mastering, especially it's in Italy. But now it's opening to international networks, promoting fair work conditions. And what we have been doing in the past years is being to step from the protest to concrete proposals. According to institutional reports, gang mastering in Italy is a business of 5 billion euros per year. Our founder, so we're talking about something that has a big place in agricultural food supply chain. Our founder, Jean-Pierre Ivansagné, he comes from Cameroon. He graduated as an engineer in Politecnico di Torino. In 2011, he was employed as an agricultural worker in Puglia, that is a region in the south of Italy. I'm also from the south, and unfortunately, this region knows very well these poor conditions where the agricultural workers face. So in 2011, Ivansagné promotes the Pacific protest that was then known in all of Italy as Rivolta di Nardò, which led to the first Italian anti-gang mastering law. Is the law 199 of 2016, which modified for the first time an article of the penal code. Okay, the article of the penal code that was modified by this law of 2016 was the 603 bis, if someone is really into this field. In the meantime, from 2011, Ivan and this method became famous thanks for books he wrote, lectures in schools and university, and the public support he received both from journalists such as Roberto Saviano, and the participation to different movies. Like the last one is the one from Milo Rao about the new vandalist. He was also honored by the charge of the Knight of the Republic by the President Mattarella, and his action to promote fair labor conditions to agricultural workers was then structured in 2017 into NOCAP Association. What we try to do with NOCAP is to put at the same level agricultural workers, producers, distributors, and consumers. The idea which started the turning point from the protest to proposal was the creation of a multi-parameter ethic label. This label certifies products which are created with no exploitation of workers. This is how one fight that started playing. Is to give us the time to reflect on what we're saying. So this multi-parameter ethic label, this creation, was a turning point on the fight, because one fight that started to claim from migrants' rights in the last year has been turning into a procedure that helps workers. Workers meaning Italian workers, migrant workers, women and men. Going a little bit back to numbers, just to give you a big overview of perspective, the total revenue for agriculture sector in Italy is more than 500 billions per year. And despite the fact that we very often think about agricultural workers as migrants, just migrants, actually the 62% of workers, of agricultural workers are Italian, and just the 38% are migrants, both coming from EU country and extra EU country. Among them, it's true that like the most affected people by gang mastering are the one who are, of course, who has, of course, less guarantees. And so among this 38%, we very often as people who suffer slavery. According institutional reports, this means that, of course, there are much more. We have 500 million of people which every year are in slavery conditions in Italy. But how does this certification works? The certification of a product starts with an exchange of documentation with the enterprise that is followed by inspections, both from NOCAP inspectors and DQA experts, which is a third-party entity which is authorized by the Ministry of Agriculture. We do this inspection in the places of work. If the first parameter of this multi-label, which is the ethical work condition, is fulfilled, the product obtained the NOCAP ethic label. There are other parameters. I can go maybe later on if you're interested. If the enterprise obtains, actually not the enterprise, but the products obtains the ethic label, NOCAP work is then split on two levels. On one level, it acts on the field. It ensures services related to the person, such as free accommodation, free transport to the places of work, legal assistance, and medical visits to the workers. Their enterprises are themselves encouraged and helped to carry on social projects, such as employing workers, both Italian and migrants, who were victims of gang mastering, or women who were victims of human trafficking. For many of the workers involved in such products, the experience with NOCAP represents the first opportunity to get out from invisibility. The other level we work on is the distribution side. So we promote NOCAP products both on the communication and the commercial side, thanks to relations we've been building in the past 10 years with fair trade shops on one side and national and international big distribution channels on the others. This is how on February the 19th, NOCAP created the first Italian certified ethic supply chain through a label that is Yamme NOCAP that put at the same table all the actors of the supply chain. Why we believe that NOCAP action is truly revolutionary, because it goes from activities on the field to relations with other actors of civil society, such as third entity of the third sector, institutions, and decision makers. Therefore, it changes agricultural production methods and their relations into the agricultural system. I don't know if we want to go deeper into the interaction, into how it works, our interaction with decision makers, but maybe we can go on later. I don't know. Patty, you tell me.
That's all.
I Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry for those technical glitches. We were just trying to clean up some unwanted visitors. They were good for entertainment, but it lasted a little bit too long. So we needed to clear them out. But in terms of moving forward, Elena, I think you can take us through. You can take us through that in the next step. I was just thinking that even as you are speaking to us now, I think you've said something that's quite interesting to say that, you know, some of the migrants that you have worked with, you know, working with NOCAP is presenting what you're calling the first opportunity to get out of being invisible. And I think this is a consequence of what's happening around, you know, migrants that are discriminated. And I'm also thinking about some of the images that you have shared before, not just in this forum, but also, you know, also with other media houses, of what these living conditions looked like, and the stark differences that you see. And I was just wondering if you could speak for about a minute or two in how you are engaging other actors to come across to sort of jump into what seems to be a win-win situation for all, because it seems to be a win situation for the migrants, a win situation also for other workers, so the influence is quite good, and also trying to see how you're working there with local authorities much more concretely to upscale.
Okay, yes, I'll try. In this past couple of years, basically, we are happy that we've been raising our interaction with decision makers, and our project, NOCAP project, is becoming a pilot project. We had our first big recognition of the quality of our work through the institutional invitation to participate to the National Technical Table at the Ministry of Work and Social Politics to fight gang mastering and work exploitation. This produced the 3-year plan that was approved on February the 2020. What you were asking me about also the interaction with other civil society organization, it's something that we started the past February, using the opportunity that was given by a decree from the Interior Minister, the 34 of the 2020, that gave the opportunity to enterprises gave the opportunity to migrants to be regularized by the assumption from some enterprises. So what we did was to help many migrants to be regularized on the Italian territory using this law. They moved from ghettos where they were living before to decent accommodation thanks to our interaction with Casa Sankara, who is an association that works together with the region of Puglia and is the one who has in charge this house. Thanks to the help of other civil society organization, that is Association Ghetto Out, as the name shows. They try to get people out from ghettos in communication with Puglia region, employed with regular contracts by one of our enterprises, which is Prima Bio. This was the very first opportunity to inaugurate good practices of cooperation among region, enterprises, and third sector entities and the workers, giving dignity and recognition of basic human rights to many people, and also putting into practice the law on regularization. Just to give you some few other numbers. In 2020, NOCAP contributed to the regular assumption of more than 500 agricultural workers from 20 different enterprises, with which we started a path where ethical work and recognition of rights is becoming a value to pursue that goes beyond profit. So of course we cannot ask to enterprises to dismiss their their objectives of profit. That is why they stand in the market, but we can ask them to put it next to other values that showing that it's a model that can put different things going on the same path. That is something that sometimes we think either there is something that is just for free, or we give some charity, either is business. And what we're trying to do is to reverse this paradigm and putting things that actually works on the market and works for people's rights.
Thanks, Elena, for that intervention. And just thinking about COVID and what it has actually meant in terms of governments realizing in some way or another that there has to be a turning point. I think there are examples also that come from Portugal, and we will hear a bit more from Vasco later. There's examples that you have given also from Italy that have shown where migrant workers have moved from being invisible, undocumented, to being in some way depicted as heroes, as part of frontline workers, and also being given this the opportunity to become regular migrants. And maybe we can talk a little bit more in the next couple of minutes of how we can build this up looking forward, and how actually that impacts on moving forwards elimination of all forms of discrimination. But another essential part of this objective is also where governments were coming together to try and look for this sort of called open and evidence-based public discourse on migration and migrants. And I'm coming now to Eva to just walk us through, because this is essentially also important in as much as you want to eliminate all forms of discrimination. There's a lot of information that's coming behind. Why do people find themselves in a position to discriminate against migrants or discriminate against another? And I think this has got a lot to do with information. And just before I bring Eva and ask her the focus question that we would like her to look at, let me just introduce Eva Garson, and she has a bachelor in veterinary medicine and as well as a master in international cooperation for development. So a very interesting mix there, and a master in human rights, which she got from the London School of Economics, where she focused on migration and refugees. She's worked in Ethiopia, in Spain, and in Egypt for several organizations, as well as public institutions. And she is currently the migration and displacement lead at Oxfam Intermon, where she specializes on narratives for social change to build alternatives to hate speech and polarization. So Eva, we were hoping that, having you here would, give us a sense and try to understand the question on what have we achieved in terms of trying to promote this so-called evidence-based discourse on migration. And maybe before we even get to that, could you just break it down to us what it means? Because, some of this lingo keeps hanging around with us, and English is not a mother tongue for all of us. So, what would we really mean when we're talking about evidence-based? And at the same time, also trying to understand what remains to be done in terms of us reshaping a values-based public perception on migration.
Thank you very much, Patty, and thank you for the opportunity of being here. So maybe to address your question on what it means to have an evidence-based discourse on migration, I will just use an example. So the official data tells us that only 3.5% of the world population are international migrants. So only 3.5% of the world lives outside of their countries of origin. But if you start asking people how many people they think, or what percentage of people they think that live outside of their countries of origins, you're gonna get an answer between 40 and 60%. So that's how a distorted narrative has managed to create an image of migration that has nothing to do with evidence. So that's why it is so important to bring back the migration debate back to the field of evidence and data. When I was thinking about what we have achieved, I'm of course speaking from an international development organization, but in these years, I have had the chance to interact with many different actors, local authorities, journalists, migrants' rights organizations, other international NGOs. And I think these achievements are kind of true for almost every actor. The first one would be the awareness of the importance of narratives, and it connects with what I was saying. So the language, the stories, the images, the messages that we hear about migration every day and from different sources, they are not harmless. They shape the individual behavior and the institutional practice. So they are essential to enable social change. And if we don't tackle damaging narratives or damaging public discourse, we might be perpetuating. We might be perpetuating discrimination, and the public discourse is what the public discourse is what sometimes makes people or puts certain people in place to discriminate others. So this is how important it is. And I think there is an increase in awareness because there is more and more people and organizations and institutions interested in this topic every day. And I've seen this interest grow massively in the last years. Second achievement, we have now a quite thorough understanding of how the anti-migration discourse or the criminalizing discourse works and the fears that it speaks to. And I can probably elaborate a little bit on these fears later if the audience is interested, but it very much relates to the three crises that Vasco was mentioning in his intervention. So we know that the anti-migration discourse is built on fears, on atavic fears that we all have by default, and they are very smart in activating those fears. But now through research, as I said, we have achieved a lot of understanding on how this anti-migration discourse works. Third achievement, we've gained self-awareness of how our own communication practices are important in shaping the public discourse on migration. And I'm talking about individual practices. Every time we speak about migration, be it on a professional capacity, but also in your family discussions, you are shaping the public discourse on migration. And we've realized that how both individuals and institutions, even with the best of intentions, we had sometimes reinforced damaging stereotypes. And we had actually been reinforcing the anti-migration discourse, sometimes even with the intention to negate it, but we've been doing that. So now we know what we need to stop doing in terms of our own communication practices. And finally, another achievement, we know how disinformation works. So it's related to fake news, but it's broader than fake news because it's also misleading information and things like that. And we know that this information is at the core of shaping negative perceptions about migrants and migration. And there are a lot of initiatives now relying on fact checkers and verified information to actually bring back the limits between fact and opinion so that we can have, as I was saying at the beginning, an evidence-based discourse. Some things that remain to be done, and I will be very short because we can probably collectively elaborate on this after. What remains to be done to actually develop a strong values-based migration narrative that it's able to substitute the criminalizing discourse. So basically, we need to learn more about what to do. We know what not to do, and we know how the anti-migration discourse works, but we haven't been able to actually find that narrative that is actually able to shift public perceptions. But we have a lot of hints about how to go about it, so that we're not completely lost. We need to continue to improve our own communication practices until we are completely broken free from the anti-migration discourse, and we are able to think and write and speak on our own terms, so that we move from a word cloud that talks about invasion, problem, crisis, to a word cloud that talks about project, entrepreneurship, aspiration, family, which is what migration is really about. And then finally, we need to still work on tackling disinformation until we promote a culture change so that people stop sharing disinformation. People stop sharing pieces of information that they suspect might not be true. And I always say, in the same way that we've learned, I don't know, for example, how to recycle or other civic norms that we've all embraced because we know they are essential, we can definitely change the culture and stop sharing this information. I'll stop here, Paddy.
I was just going to ask you to add in 1 minute, or we can also add this as you come along in your next intervention. You know, thinking about, I think you've said something that's quite striking. I mean, the power of misinformation, and this is what we have seen even much more prevalent during COVID. Even from whatever kind of news is coming out. I give an example of steaming. The big word, the buzzword, at least in my country, in Zambia, is steaming. Everyone is out steaming. And steaming is not steaming your whole body, but it's really taking the steam and inhaling the steam. But the news that goes with steaming has skyrocketed. And some of the things, it's the same thing that went with Trump suggesting that we should take disinfectant, and what power it has, misinformation in terms of the number of people who are dying, or the number of cases that are being reported, or misinformation in any kind of way. I just wanted to bring you to the responsibility that social media houses have, and some of the work, and maybe here I will ask also Vasco as a point to put there, because I know that IOM, among other actors, has been working with big, with the social media powerhouses in terms of how to deal with misinformation. We have also seen how powerful it has been, even in the face of the US elections and what that has meant. And I think we can get examples actually from all parts of the world. But just coming back to discrimination and what that means, Eva, do you want to say something along those lines, responsibility of social media houses and misinformation?
Yeah, sure. I think there is a strong responsibility of social media houses, but I think it can also, it entails a lot of individual responsibility. It started as a small project, but it's growing now, called Maldita Migración, which is an alliance with fact-checking journalists. What they do is they fact-check this information on migrants and refugees that they receive through the community. So people who receive a piece of information in their WhatsApp and they suspect that it's not true, they send it to these fact checkers, and then they receive the verified information through a very, very strict verification process. So then these people, instead of sharing the disinformation, they share the verified piece of information. And we've managed to involve the community. We've managed to involve all those people who were actually worried about disinformation and about how disinformation can actually exacerbate discrimination against certain groups. And I think social media, some social media houses have also resorted to similar fact checkers, and sometimes to the same fact checkers, to expose this information. So sometimes now when you go into Facebook or Twitter, you can read or you can see that something has been labeled as disinformation. You can still see the piece, but you are aware that that's not true. And I think that's a very smart way to go.
Thank you for that, Eva. And I will give you a challenge for the next round as you think about it, is misinformation coming from government. And I think that we have also seen quite prevalent, especially looking at the local politics and what that has meant. And I think in some cases it has also led to discrimination against migrants. Here I have a very specific example coming from South Africa, where migration data was given out by a senior government official trying to show the number of migrants that South Africa was actually hosting, and the department within the government system refuting and saying actually those facts were not right, but it was used in a context that was meant to empower the local politics. And I think this is not just an example that comes from South Africa, it's an example that can come from many parts of the world. In local communities that are hosting, for instance, refugees, when people have seen that the rate of crime has increased, East, it's alluded to the fact that the refugees or the communities around the refugees are the ones that are responsible for, you know, for encouraging or for bringing this higher number of criminal rates. So I will bring you back into sort of this misinformation that comes from a place we should actually be trusting, and what we can do about it. And then maybe also to talk about personal information, because, you know, when I think about discrimination, I think it's also a thing of the social value that you have, and sort of what are those key points that and those key things that, you know, we can do within the education system, whether it's formal or formal or informal, in terms of changing how we communicate around issues of being different, around issues of migration and migrants, refugees, and you know, persons of concerns in our communities. So I'll come back to you for that. But now I think let's just move on to our next speaker, who is Mustafa Kadri. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, the last name, Mustafa. And Mustafa, before I just ask Mustafa to come in and give us his, you know, his views on his intervention, let me just introduce Mustafa, who is the founder and executive director of EQIDEM, and he's an expert on labor rights research, and it's an advocacy organization, and he himself is a labor rights expert. He manages all of the organization's projects as well as the partner relations. He's a human rights researcher, as I said, and he has worked for over 20 years in various disciplines, supporting governments, working with public, international law, journalism, and also the non-governmental sector. And I also spied something on his LinkedIn, seeing some of the very interesting work that he has, done, you know, stretching out to Afghanistan, Australia, Europe, Israel, Palestine, and also having worked with private sector organizations, which I think is essentially very important partner in this space, in terms of, you know, the space that they allow for migrant workers. This is the workplace for a lot of migrant workers, and what that has meant. Mustafa, I was also very much interested to hear a little bit more, but maybe we'll come back to that a bit later, about some of your work also in the Middle East, that you have done there, that really looks at, you know, unraveling grassroots networks across communities that have been affected by human rights abuses. So we will touch upon that a bit later. But I was just thinking, in this first intervention, you know, looking at EQIDEM and the kind of work that you have done. In fact, recently you've published a report on racial discrimination faced by migrant workers due to changes in laws and practices during COVID in the Gulf countries. So could you just take us through a bit and talk to us about some of the practical manifestations that you have seen from discrimination, and how states and businesses can respond to this in respect to human rights standards, and you know, touch upon the grassroots level as well. Mustafa, over to you.
Sure. Firstly, thank you, Patty, for the really warm introduction, and that's a great summary there. We should really ask you to do that more often. You did that so succinctly. But thank you for that warm introduction, and also it's a real honor to be on this panel with other experts, people really dedicated to the rights of migrant workers. And I also, it's great to see some really great guests watching today. So we really appreciate everyone taking the time to join the conversation today. I think, you know, the issue of discrimination is so fundamental to the situation for so many migrant workers. The other speakers so far have spoken really eloquently about some of those issues. And like Patty said, what I'd like to talk about a little bit is the work that we've done, EQIDEM, looking at the last 12 months, the historical pandemic that the world has faced, and particularly in the context of the Arab Gulf countries, the racial discrimination and the consequent modern slavery that low-wage workers have faced. We've particularly focused on Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar. But of course, what we actually have found is probably not particularly unique to those countries. Unfortunately, across the Gulf, across the world, you see these issues. And what I'm talking about there, in our research, what we found was that when the pandemic hit these countries, that the governments of these nations made very discriminatory changes to the labor protections that basically, on the one hand, required employers to protect the employment benefits of nationals, while at the same time making it very easier, not much easier, for employers to hire and fire, to reduce pay, and otherwise weaken the protections of low-wage workers, basically non-nationals. And again, our analysis of that was that on its face, these legislative changes amount to racial discrimination. The other thing that we found in our research, we spoke to hundreds of workers in one-to-one interviews, and we were able to do that in the middle of a pandemic because of our network of researchers who are themselves migrant workers in these countries. And we found that, in fact, that those laws, whilst being discriminatory, effectively acted as a green light to employers to exploit workers. And that means either to keep them without pay in large crowded accommodation sites. As you know, for the first few months of the pandemic, there was a total global shutdown of the airspace. So workers could not return home. Or at the same time, they were forcing them to return home, or alternatively, keeping them working, but on much more reduced wages. And so this led to really quite shocking instances of exploitation that we document in our report in quite a bit of detail. If people want to read that, I can put a link to that in the chat box. But, things ranging from starvation to severe anxiety to, in some situations, even suicide. We interviewed, for example, women who were heavily pregnant, working as nurses in COVID wards in Saudi Arabia. Workers who were having a nervous breakdown in the United Arab Emirates or Qatar, worrying how they will send money back to their families, to their loved ones back home, because they've lost their job and they've got no capacity to challenge the decision made by their employer. Now, we of course recognize that the pandemic has had a huge economic impact on everyone. But what we also saw was in these countries, as with so many other countries, that much of the government financial support that was made available was going to the wealthiest, to the ones who are in arguably the best situation. And of course, we're not saying that, take it from one person to give to another. What we're simply saying is that there should not be discrimination in the way that you are responding to a pandemic. I mean, it sounds very obvious, but quite frankly, the situation is that all human life is equal and therefore should be treated equally. In a similar way, what we also found was in terms of access to medical care, there was severe discrimination. All the Gulf countries did say, which is a very positive thing, that anyone would be allowed to access COVID testing to get medical support if they tested positive, if they had symptoms. That's a really positive thing. But in fact, what we saw in reality was the quality of the service was much weaker, much poorer if you were a low-wage worker. So what that meant in practice is that many workers had to often spend a long time waiting simply to see medical professionals after they tested positive or had symptoms. Many were put in, overcrowded quarantine facilities where, we had photographic evidence that workers could simply not socially distance. And, even workers complained that the quality of the food given to them in these facilities was really poor. So really quite awful conditions, which in many ways, as most of us know, exacerbate rather than create a new situation of discrimination. But what we'd also say is that when you have such a huge pandemic, and yes, we recognize that it's a huge challenge for governments, at the same time, even in the best scenario, no government authority will ever have enough, officials, medical facilities, or programs to address these issues, even if they chose not to be discriminatory. Ultimately, employers also have to take a really big chunk of responsibility for making sure that basic international standards are applied to everyone in their workforce and in their supply chain, in their value chain. And so that's one thing that we're really wanting to see, which is to say that even in situations where the laws might be discriminatory, employers, business authorities, business community should be themselves proactively putting in steps to ensure everyone is treated the same, no one is left behind. The other thing that we really felt from the data that really came out was the absence of migrant workers' ability to join or form trade unions, to collectively bargain, to have collective representation is not just a human rights and a labor rights violation, which it is, but actually impedes the ability of both the state and employers to respect their labor rights. When you have thousands, if not millions of people in the same situation, whether it's the Gulf or it's internal migrants in places like India, China, across Europe, Africa, the Americas, the reality is that we're dealing with so many people that some system of collective representation is really fundamental to making sure that we respect people's rights and, of course, migrant worker rights as well. And yet what we've seen instead is over many years, a systematic attack on normal people's ability to join and form a union. So that's another thing that we really talked about as a real restriction on rights. When it comes to migrant workers, the discrimination also comes out in that because, of course, migrant workers, for a variety of reasons, including their immigration status in the country of destination, or if they're an internal migrant in the region where they've traveled to within their own country, there are sort of practical or legal barriers to them, being part of a union or getting collective representation. Often what you find in certain societies and certain business contexts, that employers or others seek to really fight, pitch local workers or indigenous workers against migrant workers. And so that is done often with a very short-sighted sentiment towards, the fact that an employer might be cutting corners or maybe be a chronic delayer of payments of wages and finding ways to avoid scrutiny for their poor conduct. So these are the sorts of things that we need to be looking at to address that. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack in that. I'm happy to go into a bit more detail in different aspects of that. But I think a key thing to really emphasize is that, the pandemic overshadows everything, but it also exposes the natural fragilities in the way that we operate. But also I like to think what it does show is the necessity of what migrants contribute to our societies. We had speakers talk about in Italy, in other contexts, in Portugal, the work that these people do. If you are a migrant worker, even though globally, of course, you're a small percentage of the population, as has been really wisely mentioned earlier, you're more likely to be doing menial or work that others do not want to do. And it's very interesting that we're seeing with the pandemic also this change in terminology from low wage work to essential work, that at least in our language, there is a recognition that what these people do is actually essential work. And I'm saying this myself, I'm working, I've got, children, I've got other things I need to deal with. For me, the support that I get from my family and also migrants in my life is essential. But what we don't see is that translating into legal and financial and social benefits. And I think other speakers are quite right to point to that xenophobia and the misinformation that goes out there. I think my concern is that those challenges are very deep. And so therefore we need to really think about both immediate and long-term strategies. I mean, the immediate ones are sort of the obvious ones, but in the long term, how do we shift away from that discourse? And I think that's a really complex, not an easy question to answer, but I really feel, based on the research that we've done in recent years, I've really become convinced, although I was always of this opinion, that trade unionism and collective representation is really key, because what it does is it's about situating the human being in a certain work context that is not about whether you're a migrant or a non-migrant. It's about things like your pay. It's about your condition. It's about when you have a family, do you have society supporting you to do what you need to do outside the workplace? And what it is about really is about solidarity in some way, in a very pragmatic sense, and not in an ideological sense, but in a pragmatic sense, talking about the fact that in different ways, we're all kind of in the same boat. Yes, some of us are much more privileged. I'm one of those people, but we are fundamentally part of a society, and we have to rely on each other to get things done. We have to create the systems that recognize that. And I think it's within that, if we can situate the conditions of migrants in that, that's a really key long-term way of addressing the discrimination. Just very lastly, on the point of the cohesion, I won't take too long on this point, but between migrants and people who are nationals of a society and the work that we do, one thing that we looked at very closely when I set up Equidem about 4 years ago was a realization that, number one, we needed to empower those that are critical to doing this work on the ground, who happen to be themselves in the same situation. We have to not just be relying on them to give us information about a certain context, or to be the ones that we give seminars to or capacity building, but we actually need to ask them, what do they want? But you also have to give them the tools to understand this level of international discussion that we're having, and therefore to generate their own strategies. So one thing that we've really tried to do at Equidem, although we're really early in that journey, is think about ways that we can empower the members of our team who are migrant workers. Now, unfortunately, many of those workers are in situations where there's high vulnerability to reprisal for speaking out about the kind of issues that they might face. So, one thing that we've really been looking at is developing national level and regional level expertise, which is to say finding ways in which, for example, our teams in East Africa or South Asia or the Gulf or in Southeast Asia can support each other on practical and expert issues, where different members of our staff might be vulnerable and therefore can't be necessarily the ones speaking out on a particular issue. What that also leads to, sort of linking to what I said earlier, is a bit of a sense of a common purpose, because what we find often then is that people who are not migrants, who might be part of our team or that we speak to, who are sympathetic to our cause, they really have a real sense of understanding that, well, what these people are dealing with, I might not have the same exact situation. I might work on something different, but in fact, fundamentally, we want the same thing. And I think it's about finding those linkages with other people, because often, if we're honest with ourselves, there is a huge sort of backlash against sort of migration. And in many ways, in fact, it is entirely, I guess, a straw person that's being built up to attack for other reasons. So it is a very difficult time for all of us who are working on these issues, and often it can be a very lonely time. So I think a key thing around that is to be really working with others, as we are doing today, to realize that we are not alone. There are others who see things as we do, and to really strategize collectively to find solutions. So I can leave it there. If there's any questions or anything you would like me to elaborate on, I'd be very happy to do that. But I'm happy to leave it at that for the time being.
Mustafa, thanks again for that intervention. I think we can come back to you a little bit later. I think one of the sort of points that I raised out in this particular Global Compact for Migration objective is trying to look at the role of sending countries as well. So I think you've elaborated very well on sort of trade unions and other migrant groups that migrant workers could be a part of in terms of raising their voice, because it's about having that space to be heard. And of course, naturally, trade unions in the space of work would be a natural place. But they are in a lot of countries, migrant workers would not be allowed to participate in trade unions, and what that and what sort of that has meant. And I wondered, speaking about that, if you found any other in the region that you're working in, if there were any creative solutions around migrant workers maybe belonging to the same country and trying to group together in terms of through different forums, so we can hear a little bit about that from you, but also what the role of the sending countries have been in trying to advocate for elimination of all forms of discrimination against migrant workers that they're sending. And here particularly I'm looking at countries that have come from Southeast Asia, because they seem to be quite mobilized in terms of bringing concerted efforts together as sending countries, or as a sending country, or maybe it's even related to industry. So we can come back to you for that. I thought we could just go on to our next speaker, quite linked to what we have also been talking about here, and I'll bring Marvin in, and just to introduce Marvin. Marvin is he's a journalist, and he's also an educator, and he has worked as a regional and international journalist in native Suriname, as well as the English-speaking Caribbean for more than 20 years, and even obtained about 5 Caribbean Journalistic Awards along the way. He's a communication consultant, and he's also the co-founder and editor of the Afro magazine, which is a Dutch magazine, and he would tell us a little bit more about the work that they do there as a news and opinion platform that tries to tell underreported stories from the local Afro community. And I think also very important to note here is that he dedicates a lot of his time to running what is known as the Weekend College. It's an education program for regional education and a training center in Amsterdam that collaborates with the municipality of Amsterdam Southeast. And he's doing a lot of coaching, mentoring, and working with a number of volunteers and interns in that program around issues that are related to social organization in Amsterdam Southeast. He's a frequent speaker on diversity and racism matters with a specific focus on media, and he regularly shares his views and reflections on inclusion in education. And he is a member of the Black Members Council of the British National Union of Journalists, as well as the European representative of the Association of Caribbean Media Workers. I decided that I would read that out, Marvin, because I think it's very important for people to understand that you carry these two or rather triple hats, in my opinion, as I read this. And I like the very first thing that you said when we had our prep meeting, where you were saying, readers are your consumers, and I think that was very important coming from the media side of things, to know that you would like to give good food to your consumers. And therefore, we're very interested to hear sort of from your experience as a journalist and as a writer and as a founder, and in the capacity of the work that you do, including the partnerships that you have in the UK and in Europe, what you sort of see as the work that you have done in trying to push media efforts to eliminate all forms of discrimination, condemn and counter expressions, acts and manifestations of racism, racial discrimination and violence, particularly in your area. And the gaps, I think, that you sort of have seen from the Dutch government side, because you are in the Netherlands and you are from the Netherlands, so you understand the challenges that have been there. We also want to hear a little bit more about who are the actors that you have there, who are the people that you sort of bring on board, or who should be on board in trying to bring this work along. And then, also talk a little bit about the local space that we have in terms of what space is there in terms of local politics for migrants to engage in. And as an educator, I think you could run us through what the missing elements are. I've spoken a lot, but I think Marvin will do justice to the questions. Thanks, Marvin.
Good afternoon, Patty. And yeah, you're not seeing it, but I'm blushing with your broad introduction of me. That was a mouthful of a question indeed. I hope that that I'll be able to keep your attention, that I'll be able to keep it interesting enough to keep your attention. But good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for having me. Like Patty was saying, I must stress that I'm not a technocrat. Like many people here in this panel, I can mostly speak from my own experience and my own views about my own views, and from my experiences here in the Netherlands. Again, I hope I can keep you interested. I've been here for 8 years now. I live in a little village close to Amsterdam. I moved to the Netherlands 8 years ago, and it happened last week that I had a discussion with a friend of mine about the difference between an expat and an immigrant. My friend is a Jew from New York, and he's a white man, and he does the same kind of thing that I do. He's a journalist. He runs an online magazine, and he is called an expat. I'm called an immigrant. So it will always baffle me that there's a distinction that people make when they speak about immigrants, the disdain that they have for immigrants like me, as opposed to other Western country immigrants. And the funny thing about that is that I've seen it in multiple countries that I've lived in before I decided to settle down in the Netherlands. In Suriname, where I was born, it's a country in South America, as former Dutch colony. People would look down at immigrants from Haiti, from neighboring Guyana, and from Cuba. In St. Martin, where I also lived, that's a small island in the Caribbean, 80% of the community is of immigrant descent. And only a small percentage of that remaining 20% is actually born there. But I remember how much they despised immigrants. I remember how it felt to me when people that I worked with, people that I considered friends, would wear a T-shirt that had "Born Here," "I from here" written on it. So migrants weren't from there, so they were less than locals. And many locals who wore these T-shirts were friends of mine. But it shouldn't have bothered me because it was not about me, and I was different from the rest. And the thing is, I've heard this kind of statement in many other countries where sort of right-wing nationalists have this disdain toward migrants. You're not from here, but at the same time, if you're doing well, you're not like the rest. I remember a guy telling me once that I don't sound and I don't act like the others. They don't realize how insulting it was. But personally, I have always deplored nationalism. I've always known that it was stupid not to recognize the wealth and that comes from travelers, from visitors. So I left Suriname when I was 23, and I didn't leave, but I left to go to see the world. And I decided to move permanently here to the Netherlands when I was 44. I'm 52 now. I've been all over the world. I had a wealth of experience, so I knew how I wanted to be treated. But nonetheless, I still encountered racism and marginalization here from when I arrived here. And I could tell you many stories, but it would take me way past the time that's allotted for me to speak. But it's the experience that many migrants encounter, especially migrants that look like me. The difference is that I'm a writer. I have a pen and it's sharp like a razor blade. And plus, I'm a big guy, so people tend to not mess with me. But so I knew how I wanted to be treated, and I demanded it, and I demanded it publicly. To your question, Patty, we have a racist practice here that just doesn't go away. It's called Zwarte Piet or Black Pete. Every year on the 5th of December, white people put on blackface to portray this slavish helper of a saint who brings goodies to children. Activists have been protesting against it forever, especially in the last 8 to 10 years. But it has proven to be very difficult to make racists understand that racism hurts. And as a journalist, I've sided with anti-racism activists. And my specific goal, like you said, is to change the subjective way journalism is practiced when it comes to reporting on racism. Honestly, when it comes to racism, I'm subjective myself. And I've had disagreements with other journalists about that who feel that a journalist should not be subjective ever. He should be able to remain objective. And I disagree because I believe that you cannot be journalistically objective when it comes to racism. And ironically enough, I've lost friends over the years who didn't seem to realize that they were angry at me only because I was demanding to be treated like everybody else, that my Black life matters. Can you imagine that? So I write lengthy rants on Facebook about this and about my other experiences. I started Afro Magazine where I write opinion pieces about it. I use my journalism as my activism. I speak about this kind of stuff regularly. What hurts me the most is when journalists side with racists. We have seen here extremely subjective reporting about Zwarte Piet, where anti-racism activists were being portrayed as pests. the language that's being used. Newspapers that publish articles that call anti-racism activists leftist terrorists. There was one opinion writer who literally said that certain activists should move back to where he came from. You know, so as a member of the Black Members Council, I co-wrote 2 years ago. I co-wrote a motion in which we called on Dutch journalists to uphold ethics in journalism. Last week, during our last meeting, the Black Members Council agreed to hold a meeting soon with Dutch journalists where we will be addressing these matters. It's a full-time job. And I also use my position in education to call attention to these things. Like Patty was saying, I manage an educational support activity for immigrant children in Amsterdam. And one of the things that I do is that I go to schools with parents when the schools want to place their children at lower educational levels because of where they came from. I remember a girl from Syria who they wanted to drop to vocational level, even as she was proving that she could handle math and biology and other beta subjects with ease. They wanted to hold her back because she was lagging behind in Dutch. So I pleaded with the school to reconsider, with the promise that my organization would help this child and that she would get the help, the TLC that she needed, and that we would make sure that she could handle higher levels. Well, it's 3 years later, and this child from Syria, this refugee child, is about ready to graduate from that level where they wanted to drop her from, and she will start university next year. If I hadn't intervened, she would have been held back and her potential could have gone to waste, which would have kept her entire family in a cycle of mediocrity. So every year there's at least 3 or 4 of these children that I have to go fight for. Last month, we're in a lockdown now in the Netherlands. Last month, just days before the lockdown started, I was supposed to go meet with another school who wanted to expel a 15-year-old boy from Ghana. He wants to be an accountant later, but and they wanted to expel him because he fought with a couple of other boys who were teasing his little brother. So they wanted to mess up his whole future only because he wanted to be a bigger brother. I haven't been to the school yet because of the lockdown, but my experience is that schools back down from these kind of practices when people like me show them that we're watching. My story goes to say that we all have a role to play. I know how I want it to be treated, and there's no way I'm gonna let anybody else be treated in a way that I think I don't deserve. I hope I answered your question.
I think you did so excellently, as a journalist would, and very concise as well. I should pick some. I should have to do a speaking course with you, Marvin. I think after this, I think. But I think a very, like I said, from the very beginning, contentious issues, and that really bring to light what discrimination can look like. And I think you have your last point there in saying that we all have a role to play stands out as very important, and that's why we have these conversations and bringing out different actors around the room to share, how we can move ahead with this objective. We are recognizing that this objective was set out in 2018 when a number of countries came together. And I wonder whether these kind of stories were at the back of their minds. I wonder whether these kind of stories, and I'm sure they were, because even if we look back at, for instance, the International Convention that looks at eliminating all forms of discrimination, these are the kind of issues that were coming out even at that time, as far back as in 1969, as far back as 2018, when GCM was adopted. And today in 2021, we still have the same issues. We can blame COVID, or we can just say COVID helped us to see a bit more clearly. So thank you very much, Marvin, for touching on that. I will come back to you in our very short round next time. And I think maybe it's also to talk a little bit about this sort of what local authorities struggle with between what is integration and what is discrimination. Maybe essentially important that you learn the Dutch language for integration, but maybe at which stage should you really be doing this? A lot of countries, of course, are going for, before you become a permanent resident or before you even actually become a citizen, you should learn the local language, which makes sense in terms of integration, but maybe it's the how-to that leads to this vague and open space where discrimination easily comes in when it's especially not very well interpreted, and it doesn't come from a very inclusive point of view, looking at the migrants' needs as well at hand. And maybe at this point, I bring in Andrew Koo from who will join us. Andrew, I hope you are here and still with us. Andrew?
Yes, very much so, yes. Still
super.
here.
Super. You are last but not the least, and Andrew is joining us as he's a member of the Bar Council of Migrants, Refugees and Immigration Affairs Committee in Malaysia. It's already fully packed, that I have to say that. I've asked him a ton of questions, so if I go into his intro, I may end up spilling one or two things. And I think, Andrew, what we wanted to hear from you, I think more from this Southeast Asia perspective. Now, we understand, for instance, racial equality is an issue, is an issue in many parts of the world. It is an issue in Malaysia, and it is an issue particularly because we know that, for instance, Malaysia, I think it's Malaysia, Brunei, and Myanmar are the three countries in Southeast Asia that have not ratified the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. And I wanted to get a sense from you, what would you say to us is sort of the bone of contention there, if you could touch a little bit on that. And then, do you really see this, so maybe as actors and sitting in the room would think, if this is ratified, it would solve a lot of problems. What do you see as the impact on sort of the social structures around this? And sort of any examples that maybe you would also like to point to us in terms of, mechanisms that have been built or set up in Asia that look at the sub-objective that seeks to think about these mechanisms that not are just only, detecting, but are also being able to mitigate and can give some kind of a tracking. So we're able to see, where do these complaints go? And this question, I think, also will come back again to other speakers such as Vasco to pick up on it as we go. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paddy, and good evening to everyone. It's evening in Malaysia at the moment, and thanks for the invitation to be a part of this very interesting conversation. Firstly, just a little bit of a disclaimer, since I am a lawyer. I am a member of the Bar Council of Malaysia's Migrants, Refugees and Immigration Affairs Committee, but my comments here are my own and do not necessarily reflect the official view or any view of the Bar Council as a whole. So it's just my views and my thoughts. I think in Malaysia, and then looking also a little bit to Myanmar and Brunei to some extent, I think whatever issues that we're currently facing, we already faced it even in a pre-COVID situation. So it's not as though these things have just arisen since COVID-19 was discovered or diagnosed. So we have already existing issues in terms of racial inequality. And for Malaysia, for Brunei, and for Myanmar to some extent, the issue of race or the definition of race is interlinked with religion. So the interplay between racial, religious, national identity becomes very important. And so even if you don't look at migrants, you already have within the existing community, existing population, existing citizenship, you already have discriminatory actions because of entrenched rights or privileges that are actually mentioned in the Constitution, right? So even in your founding documents, right from the get-go, you already have a certain level of an uneven playing field. And of course, sometimes this is justified due to historical injustices. So one group will say that, you know, under colonial rule, we were really hard done by. The colonial masters didn't really promote our interests. They seem to do things for other people, and yet we are the majority community in this country. So when the founding fathers, established a new nation, they made some attempt to try and rectify this past injustice by allowing a certain degree of preferential treatment or preferential privileges that would apply to certain communities only. And then the question is, you know, the definition of how you fit into that community. And oftentimes, religion does play a role in identifying or defining who is a member of that community. So, if you want to talk about the elimination of racial discrimination, as Malaysia, we had a quite a serious conversation about it 2 years ago, and there was some commitment on the part of the then government to say that we are going to go ahead, we are going to ratify, ICERT, and then from even within the governing coalition at that time. When this was disclosed, or when people began to think about it a little bit more, and then somebody injected the idea that, oh, if you're going to accede to ICERT, you're going to have to give up some of these privileges, and then suddenly people say, well, no, I'm not in agreement to want to give up, and although these were perhaps privileges that were intended to be time bound, they were not so accurately expressed in the Constitution. And so people over the years have decided that, no, it's not time bound. It's meant to be there for perpetuity. And so they rely on that. And, the idea that taking it away would be something that would take away from their rights and the constitutional rights. So there's often this contestation. So you'll see it in Malaysia, you see it to a certain extent in Brunei, and again also to a certain extent, I think in Myanmar as well. In Malaysia and Brunei, the religion in question would be Islam. In Myanmar, it would be Buddhism. But whatever it is, it's the majority religion, and sometimes the majority community that may have been the minority when it comes to economic rights and things like that. So there is that degree of slight imbalance. So when you want to talk then about migration or migrant workers, then you complicate things even more, because especially when you talk about migration, then you are saying that, okay, do we allow yet another group of people to come into a country and to try to gain some sort of either permanent residence or citizenship status? And then the question then is what are the rights that would attach to such people? Already there's contestation within the groups that have been there historically. What more if you start talking about newcomers, and always there will be that tension about the newcomers trying to take away, again, the whole idea of, we're already debating about our rights amongst the original components of society, and then what if you talk about newcomers? They will just dilute our rights even more. So that leads to this idea of xenophobia to a certain extent, the idea that other people are coming to take away our rights or to dilute our privileges. And so that also leads to, I think in Malaysia at least, that sense of we don't want, or we're going to make it very difficult for people to be able to become legal immigrants in this country. So we can give them work status, we can give them I think Mervyn was quite correct. You talk about the expatriates. The expatriates are high income earners who are foreigners who come and work in the country and maybe have some fast track to settling down, at least because of money that they may bring into the country and invest. But then you have the discrimination against people on the lower end of the socio-economic scale. So your actual migrant workers, the people who come in from other countries to do the menial work or the low paid work, what sometimes is referred to as the 3D kind of work, difficult, dangerous, and diminishing in terms of standards. So you certainly don't want to allow them. So the thinking would go, you wouldn't want them to be able to gain any form of immigration status that would allow them the right to remain in your country. So I think that's where the challenge is for attitudes towards migration. I hope that's in some ways answered the question that you've posed, Patty.
I think so. And then I guess I'm wondering what a complaint mechanism would look like. And here I'm particularly thinking of that, which could be linked even to a human rights commission, or working with other migrant institutions or sort of overseas employment institutions of migrant workers of countries that are sending labor to Malaysia, for instance. Having lived in Malaysia myself, I think I never saw such a diverse, in terms of diverse workplace as you had. And the workplace doesn't mean just, I think, an office, but I think I would also say a workplace in terms of just a general compound. When you walked into a compound, from the guard who's from Nepal, the maids and the nannies from Philippines and Thailand and India, and chefs coming from different countries, in the supermarkets and in the grocery stores, in the restaurants, in the service sector, you have migrants lined up, I think, in all the different sectors. So it's quite interesting, I think, what you've put across, but I think it's also very clear, and I think it links very much to what Eva was trying to talk about in terms of this value-based narrative that people have sort of also given, and I think that's what we sort of need to move towards to, what do we base, what's the value that we see in terms of migrants as well, and what they bring to us, because they are supporting this ecosystem. Also as Mustafa had put forward, we're calling them frontline workers, but actually, sitting around in many parts of our life today is migrants contributing to the work. But with systems and policies, it's sort of them and us still. Their services, yes, but them coming to take part in everything that we take a part of, it still remains problematic. And I think, Andrew, like you said, in many parts of the world, it's still like this. And I think it was good to hear the examples that you gave us from Malaysia. I'm just wondering if we can take another 1 minute each from each of you with the questions that I think I have posed, maybe starting again with Vasco. Looking at some of the work there with IOM, and Vasco, I also wanted to pick on you and think about some of the grassroots work, because I think Eva had said something about, this whole thing of what do we do next, improving communication practices. I think sometimes it also happens around simple things like food. And I remember the first time that you have met, you've told me of a very interesting initiative, I think, that you have been a part of in your previous role. So maybe you can take us a little bit and give us a bit of example in the 1 minute, and then we take the next.
Thank you so much, Patty. Oh, yes, of course, I would talk about that. I mean, I would just highlight, if you allow me, just 2 words about what your previous speaker spoke about. First of all, I would say that I'm privileged to live in a country, and this is something that's the sign of politicians. It's also very important. So I'm privileged to live in a country where exactly when the pandemic started in March, there was a decision by the government with all migrants with pending applications. So all migrants that were somehow in a irregular situation, they were considered to be regular. in order to allow them to access to all the benefits on social benefits, on health, on social housing. So I think the sign from the government, from the top, also help us to shape all the immigrants media that all of us in the country might have. So I think this is an example on how other governments in the future can also, or currently, could also help shaping the views of migrants in their own countries, and making sure that, as Mustafa said, the essential workers are recognized as such. And for me, this is actually very important, especially in the day, and this is actually coming up today, where we had a report where, according to which the migrants themselves, all the foreigners, only the foreigners living in Portugal, contributed with 884 million euros to the social security system. I repeat, 884 millions. The foreigners alone contributed to the social security system in Portugal. So sometimes the numbers and the facts are also important in shaping narratives regarding migrants. And following what Eva mentioned about Maldita Migración, I have been following them for a long time. They are absolutely amazing. But one thing I can know for sure is that sometimes it's not only about facts. It's not only showing the facts on debates with other ones. Sometimes it is, and there has been a lot of substantial evidence that indicates that sometimes that creating new narratives around social cohesion and community stability and common issues and interests are the best way to fight back this negative narratives and stereotypes that are provided. So I think that's my personal view, of course, and also I think IOM agrees on it based on some of the examples, is that sometimes this narratives should be created along emotive human stories that somehow allow people to relate themselves to it. And again, it's not only about numbers, but this is also very important. So I would highlight, just to finish, 4 examples of, and I'll finish with the one based on the food that you just mentioned. 4 examples, one of them, or 3 of them are based on what IOM has done to reshape or to at least to reconnect with people connected and fighting racial discrimination. One is the campaign called Reimagining Human Mobility, and is based on the story of 7 migrants. And then they share their individual stories about overcoming the xenophobia and discrimination, and when they return home in face of the global mobility restrictions. And the stories of this Vanessa, Farouk, Yoksta are very powerful stories. And somehow this is a technique that I think it's very productive as well, trying to reconnect people along real life stories. Also, we had this film festival, IOM Film Festival about migration. This is something that has been going on for a long of time, and it has been created a lot of success. Third of all, there is another campaign called It Takes a Community. So the campaign engages a very huge range of government, city, civil society, and business to shift the narrative on migration and migrants. It is done by showing cases of real stories of social inclusion and building up some community and solidarity sentiments around the population. Finally, this very important Global and Migration and Media Academy. This is something for me I would highlight as well, because it's not only important to shape people's perceptions, but also making sure that the press, the media have also access that about all the knowledge and ethical standards. And this is exactly what IOM does with this academy, that will equip students of journalism and media worldwide with online tools, contextual knowledge, and ethical standards that will need to report fully on migration in this fast evolving information age. So the objective is to allow them, to provide them with all the tools necessary to make sure that they can portray what is happening from the migrants' perspective, of course, what is happening right now. I think this is also very important. And finally, but not least, what the example you just mentioned is what I call the family next door. It's a project, and how powerful is a simple story of sitting everyone at the same table and sharing a plate of food. And why this is important? It is important because the concept of the project is just making sure that on the specific date you will receive a family that you don't know from that has a migrant background, and you sit at the same table, and the objective is me as a national and the other ones as a migrant bring up a national dish from their own country, and they sit at the same table and they talk. It looks like a very simple example, but you cannot even imagine the feedback and the impact that they have. Just the simple fact that two families that do not know each other from ever sit and share, and a little bit of the culture of their own country. It's a very simple exercise. It's a very easy idea to promote, not expensive at all. It's just about making sure that you have collecting all the people that are interested in following in, and it has huge results. And again, sometimes it's the simple gestures that have the most powerful effects, and I think this is a good example. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Vasco. And I think it really speaks into one of the commitments that is sitting on this objective. And I think it's not just looking at the bigger things that we can influence, but I think it's also influencing mindsets, and it's influencing what we put in sort of our, if I could call it some sort of a value system. And I think food is an important element of it, and understanding cross-culture exchange is essentially very important. Last week in GCM discussion on GCM 16, I think this was also it, how do we bring groups of migrants, and this was particularly looking at the South, in the Gulf countries, looking at the exchange of cultures as well, that maybe people may be allowed to practice their own cultures, but it's very much separated and interlinked. The Bangladeshis on one side, the Indians on another side, the Filipinos on another side, but could cross cultures also encourage much more social cohesion, but then again also mingling much more with the local community in trying to understand each other and possibly be able to get rid of evils such as discrimination. I see if I could just get to Eva, and Eva, the questions that this whole thing of this what to do, and I think this is where you ended before, and I'm trying, and the question that I gave you in trying to tackle misinformation that's coming from the space of government.
It's not an easy task, and I guess it's very context specific, but I noted something that Marvin said before, and I think it's important that they know that they're being watched. So the role of people who are actually verifying what politicians say, I think it's very important. And then we would need to work on building a social movement against tolerating this kind of disinformation coming actually from the people that you should be able to trust. It might take time because unfortunately, for some reason now it's sort of okay for politicians to lie to us about key issues that actually stigmatize people, but we should go back and build a movement of tolerance zero against this kind of disinformation. I will very briefly mention what Vasco said. I think it's really, fact checking is very important. The data are very, very important, but values, it's really, our values is what makes us overcome fear. And you don't need to resort to only one value. You can use a whole range of values to actually break this distinction between us and them. I think something that COVID brought us, and I'm of course speaking from my own perspective in what happened in Spain, because in Spain there's this urban legend like that people who are who don't have regularized situation in Spain, that they live in some kind of limbo and that they're not part of the society. But what COVID proved us is that they are part of our society in many, many ways, and that those distinctions are so artificial. And the people living here in Spain are my neighbors. regardless. And I think a lot of people their attention got caught. And I think that's a good narrative line to follow.
Thank you, Eva. Elena, do you want to just touch on that element as well, continue in that same vein? Or did you want to touch more on the question that I gave you? You can take either angle.
Very, very quickly, I just regarding the narrative, Eva also was talking about during this this COVID emergency. What we've been looking in Italy was are two different lines, two different patterns, because on one way we had this facility that as NOCAP we also used, that was the ministerial decree of 2020 that helped migrants to be regularized if they were hired by enterprises. Something I just quickly want to say is that in Italy, I don't know the procedure in Malaysia, but in Italy is quite difficult to obtain as a migrant a regular working permit of stay. So we like to run on emergencies. So how a migrant can be regularized very often is on humanitarian basis. It's pretty difficult to be regularized on work under the working conditions. So on one way we have also as Mustafa was saying, the low wage works start to be essential works because we don't want that Italian do these kind of works, and we help migrants to be regularized doing these works that now are essential. And on the other way, on the narrative Eva was talking about, we also have this sort of controversial aspects, because on one way we have a new narrative that tell us about these migrants that are now regularized thanks to the new government decree that can do for us these works that now become essential. On the other way, we also have migrants that are not migrants but immigrants that bring us many cases of COVID, and with a very malicious usage of data, that it's something very essential on the communication. So I don't want to, you know, I just wanted to give you this very broad overview of what is happening in Italy now. So we on one way we have some instruments that maybe they are there for a discriminatory reason actually, but we can use them to solve some issues. On the other way, the media narrative in Italy is they like to be on the wave. So we have both narrative that are very pumped. So this is just to end with like something like a sweet and less sour, let's say.
I would say lucky for you that you're probably not the only country with this kind of narrative, especially in these days when it's difficult, I think, also for local politicians to find something to hold on to or something to blame. And I think migrants have been used, I think, even as UN Secretary General has shown that they've been used as a scapegoat. I think this is what has happened in many contexts, but this is also pre-COVID. So thank you for sharing that, Elena. Mustafa, would you just like to add, to throw in a few points?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, just to say, I mean, as we end the call, that I've been really encouraged by the discussion that we've all had, because, you know, hearing about the situation in Europe, in Southeast Asia, in the really powerful personal stories that people mention, it reminds me that, you know, there's different contexts, there's different challenges, but actually there's a lot of similarity. And that to me is very empowering, as much as, we heard that there are huge challenges there. I think that, you know, one thing for us to really think about is, as much as the world is clearly changing under our feet because of the pandemic, and as much as people have been using that as an opportunity to do very negative things, it's probably an opportunity for us to really reevaluate and rethink the way things are done. If there are initiatives out there where, for example, in Portugal, undocumented workers can become regularized as a matter of health policy, can we actually learn from that? Why did that happen? Is that something that can happen longer term? I mean, we know that with the pandemic, even if we have successful vaccine rollouts, if the rates of infection go down, it's something that will be there for a long time. And no doubt governments will now have to think about the next pandemic, the next kind of social crisis that is transnational. So again, do we need to start thinking in a transnational way in terms of the way that we collaborate as civil society? Because I think there's a lot of lessons and information and strategies that we can learn from each other. One last thing I'd say is, sort of pointing to, Paddy, what you said earlier about the sending countries, the origin countries. I think that's another aspect for us to really look at. It's a really big topic. We've got literally 5 minutes left, but just to say very quickly that, there are issues in the countries where workers are coming from that make them want to leave. And I think obviously we can't address that point straight away, but just to say, we need to think about what is driving that. I think part of that obviously is the inequality, the injustices in those societies. I think climate change is a big driver, although I think right now it seems very esoteric and distant, but even already in the work that we do, we see, for example, people from regions of emerging economies where arable land is being lost, where there's high unemployment because of environmental devastation, among other things. They're the ones choosing to migrate. So we have to think about how we address those strategies. And of course, also thinking about the role that those states play in a changing society where in, for example, Bangladesh or the Philippines, India, yes, these are relatively poorer societies, but also there are some very unscrupulous actors in those societies that exploit that vulnerability that low-wage workers or low-wage migrants have, and they profit from that system. So I think that's another thing to really stress, that as much as we should be looking at what's happening in the Gulf, in Europe, the Americas, Japan, South Korea, the developed countries, and how they're failing, and we should do that, but also many of the authorities and the powerful players in the origin states, they're not victims. So how do we deal with that? I think part of that is re-evaluating the multilateral system. The conventions, the international frameworks that we have are very good at talking about individual rights. But on the economic side and on the collective side, are often quite weak. So there's ways in which I think we can think about that. And I think the GFMD and the GCM process is a natural existing framework through which we can have those discussions. But again, I apologize, it's a very big topic that would require a lot of discussion. But yeah, again, thanks so much to all of you and to you, Paddy, for having me on. I really, really enjoyed the discussion today.
Thanks, Mustafa, for that point. And I think like Marvin had said earlier on, we all have a role to play, and sending countries have a role to play. I think it's also in glorifying your workers, and we can see you glorifying migrant workers that have left, and we can see what that has caused as a problem, a topic for another day in terms of those returning home and how they are being discriminated. So sort of like a double discrimination. You're discriminated at your place of, in your country in your host country, and when you return home because of the pandemic, you're also discriminated. You are called a returnee, or you are called many other names that we've even formed in the local languages that just show them, us and them. So I think, yes, a topic that we would need to explore further. Marvin, do you want to just add your one?
Did you ask me to add one thing on all of that?
Yes, just like your wrap-up point. What would your wrap-up point be?
I made so many notes because I really appreciated what Fasco was saying about the media academy that would teach journalists about the way they report on migrant issues. I made my notes here, so if you guys see me look away, I'm looking at my screen. I really appreciated what Fasco was saying. It reminded me of the times that I was that crazy guy in the desert screaming at nothing, because I screamed this so many times at journalists colleagues who use the word illegal. You know, I have always, as a little boy, hated borders. Even as I was growing up in Suriname, and people would speak about illegals, I always found myself wondering how anybody could be illegal on this earth. Nobody owns this place. So I always hated the notion of illegals. Mustafa was making the point earlier that I really appreciated as well. Hold on, let me find it quickly. The point of where is it now? Yeah, Mustafa was making the point of where's Mustafa? The observation about trade unions for migrants. I'm sorry, my son is driving me crazy. One quick second.
Okay, as Marvin is getting housekeeping being sorted, I think I've really enjoyed the entertainments we have had in the midst of this. Okay, Marvin, you're back with us. I let you go, then we'll have Andrew.
If anybody else has 7-year-old children, you'll know what I'm talking about. Earlier today, when I was preparing, I was speaking to a friend of mine, and she was saying basically the same kind of thing that Mustafa was saying as well, about us, many of us migrants, still being in a privileged position. So I had to explain to her that I never wanted to make it sound like the fact that I have this tenacity that put me in a space where I can make things happen has me thinking that other people who can't, that they have they have failed. But I believe that we and other people who are trying to better the situation of migrants, that we have a role to play to give them that empowerment, like Mustafa was saying, to teach them how to fight for themselves. I want to tell you a quick story, because, like I said at the beginning, I only have my own views and my own experiences that I can share. And I want to leave you with a quick story that of something that happened last weekend. It's about this. I don't know if you can see it. I'll explain to you what it is. Last weekend, I've been wanting to do this for some time. I tallied up all the money that I've spent on gas since February 2020. That month, February 2020, I got into an argument with a gas station owner, gas station manager, not far from me, over some nonsense. And he decided to treat me like a nobody. And I felt that it was because I was a migrant and because I was Black. I felt that he was being racist. So after I was done cursing him, I left and I never went back to his gas station. The next gas station is 15 kilometers down the road, but I make that effort of driving all the way down there to get my gas. Because I make an effort to not have anybody who does not treat me the way I want to be treated, to have nobody like that earn my money. It's my money. Every cent in my wallet is economic power. Oh, there's a picture. Every cent in my in my wallet is economic power that I can wield. So I never went back to him, and I drive 15 kilometers down the road. So last weekend I tallied up everything, and it came down to 2,076 euros that I spent on gas. That's more than 2,000 euros that this a-hole did not earn from me. Now, imagine if all migrants would start to realize that they can wield this kind of economic power. Last weekend, I received a press release from the UN with a report that said that that estimated that the number of migrants globally has reached 281 million. So multiply that 2,076 euros that I didn't spend with him, multiply that by 281 million. Just like what Fasco was saying, it's about, what were you saying earlier, Fasco? You were saying that figures count, the figures matter. So imagine multiplying that. But also think of my students who they wanted to hold back. Imagine the wealth in earnings, in contributions to the GDP of the countries that they live in, Imagine the wealth in remittances that they would be able to send home, back home, to help their families survive, to boost the economies of the countries that they come from. So imagine all that and multiply it by 281 million people. And I know I'm exaggerating because it's not all migrants are being held back, but still humor me. You know, that's what I'm saying. I really appreciated what Fasco was saying. Sometimes the numbers and the facts are important. I have so much more that I wanted to share with you, but so everybody else had so many more interesting things to say. I was really, yeah, honored to be among the.
Marvin, I think you have done justice to also ensuring that we cover that one very well. I think if we all, I think it's very important what you have raised, you know, knowing how you want to be treated, and that's just a practical example. And actually, funny enough, also listed out in a very practical way of how we, you know, sending countries should also think about how migrant workers that they have at home are a positive contribution where they are, but also back home. Andrew, do you want to give us your 1 minute?
Okay, yeah. So I think one of the things that I picked up from Marvin from what he said is the idea of empowerment and the idea of facilitation. So let me just explain. In Malaysia, we have laws that talk about, you know, anti-hate speech or issues where you are, you know, you want to challenge people who are putting across a negative narrative of a particular community. So, you know, you can complain. You can complain to the police. You can complain to the Human Rights Commission. And the question is, at least where law enforcement authorities are concerned, you have migrant communities who are afraid, right? Because, you know, they are complaining against sometimes even the government, because it is the government sometimes that is putting out this narrative. So if the police are there, you know, they are seen to be part of the state, part of the structure of the country, and you are, you know, you tell the migrant community, or if you are being, you know, violated, your rights are violated, or you're being discriminated against, go and complain. You're basically asking them to go face trouble. So, you know, you don't have that ability to empower people to do that. Although the law is there, as I said, theoretically it's possible, but the reality is, you know, you can't feel comfortable complaining to the police, who are agents and instruments of the government, and it's sometimes the government, as I said, that it's putting out this negative narrative. So the question then is, for civil society, for NGOs, for the Bar Council of different countries, lawyers associations, is there a way that we can facilitate this complaints mechanism? Is there a way that we can make it safer for people to actually seek redress for some of the injustices that are being visited upon them? And I think that's where we need to work at from the point of view of implementation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andrew. And I think that's a very good way to sort of end it. We know the complaints are there. We've heard the different stories, and we've heard also the different contributions that have been shared from all our panelists, which I think it was a very diverse one. I read something yesterday that struck me as something that I could just read, and it's a quote by Martin Luther King that says, "If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then you crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward." So I think that, you know, it's a good way to sort of end that and try and wrap up your very eloquent and very elaborate presentations and interventions that you have shared with us today in trying to understand and unpack what the challenges remain in terms of eliminating all forms of discrimination as part of GCM Objective number 17. And with this, I just want to say thank you to all our panelists. I think you will notice that we didn't have a Q&A session because we had closed the chat just to keep it a little bit quiet. We had some entertainers that were a little bit too happy to join us, so we had to close the chat. But we managed to, some of the questions that I was popping through had come through our mailbox. So those are the questions that you had. So the audience was with you. You had about 100, I think we had close to 200 people when we started. We still have 140 people here with us. So a big thank you to all those who are joining us, especially our scholars and also the members of GRFDT, the members of the various organizations and members of different universities that have been supporting the work that we have been doing here in engaging different actors. Special thanks to